I will marry the bride no one wants. The word stopped the entire ballroom cold. Claire Bennet stood beneath the crystal chandeliers, still holding the small bouquet she had been given only minutes earlier, while every face turned toward the man who had just spoken. Ethan Carter, the quiet outcast from the edge of town, had stepped into the center of the room as if he belonged there. He wore a simple charcoal suit, nothing like the expensive formal clothes surrounding him. No family crest. No polished title. No reason, as far as anyone could see, for him to interrupt a wedding that had already fallen apart. Yet he stood perfectly calm. Claire had just been rejected by the man who was supposed to become her husband. His family had decided she was not worthy of their name, and he had agreed with them in front of everyone. The whispers had begun immediately. Some people looked at Claire with pity. Others looked away as if her humiliation were contagious. She kept her shoulders straight. She would not cry in front of them. She had spent too many years learning how to remain composed when people decided her worth before knowing her story. Then Ethan walked toward her. The room seemed to grow quieter with every step. Claire watched him carefully. She knew who he was. Everyone did. Ethan had lived on the edge of the community for nearly a year, keeping to himself, working ordinary jobs, and avoiding the attention that came with important families. People called him an outcast because he had no known lineage, no powerful relatives, and no place among the respected alpha families. "You do not have to do this," Claire whispered when he stopped in front of her. Ethan looked at her, and there was something unexpectedly gentle in his expression. "Neither do you." Claire frowned slightly. "Then why are you standing here?" Ethan glanced toward the people who had rejected her. "Because they are looking at what they think you are." His eyes returned to hers. "I am looking at who you are." For a moment, Claire forgot about the crowd. She forgot about the whispers, the ruined ceremony, and the family members watching her from the front row. Ethan extended his hand. "You do not have to marry me today," he said. "But if you want someone who will stand beside you without being ashamed of you, I will." Claire looked at his hand. It was such a simple gesture, yet no one had offered her anything like it. Finally, she placed her hand in his. A stunned murmur moved through the ballroom. Near the back of the room, an elderly council member suddenly stopped breathing for a moment as he stared at Ethan. His face had gone pale. He whispered something too softly for anyone else to hear. "That face." Ethan noticed him. Their eyes met across the crowded room. The old man looked away almost immediately. Claire saw it. She did not understand what it meant, but she knew it mattered. Ethan turned back toward her, his expression calm again. He had come into the ballroom as an outcast. He was leaving with the woman everyone else had rejected. What nobody in that room knew was that the old council member had just recognized something buried in a memory from 20 years ago, and the moment he understood who Ethan might be, the forgotten past of the entire Alpha Kingdom began moving toward the present. The ballroom had emptied by midnight, but Claire could still hear the whispers in her mind. She sat near the tall windows of the Bennet estate, watching the last cars disappear beyond the gates. The wedding had ended without the celebration anyone expected, yet somehow she had not walked away alone. Ethan had remained beside her until every guest had left, never asking for gratitude and never pretending he had done her a favor. Now he stood near the fireplace, silent and thoughtful, his charcoal suit looking almost out of place against the elegant room. Claire finally broke the silence. "You knew what was going to happen tonight, did you?" Ethan turned toward her. "I knew something was wrong." "How?" He paused. "People reveal more than they realize when they think nobody important is watching." Claire studied him carefully. That answer sounded like him, but it did not explain why he had stepped forward so confidently. "You barely know me." "I know enough." She looked away. "Most people think they know me. That is the problem." Ethan moved toward the window but stopped several feet away, giving her space. "Then tell me who you are." Claire almost smiled. Nobody had asked her that in years. Her family knew the version of her that fit their expectations. The community knew the version they had invented from rumors. But Ethan was asking as though her answer actually mattered. "I am someone who got tired of asking other people for permission to have dignity," she said. Ethan nodded slowly. "That sounds familiar." Outside, the estate grounds were quiet beneath the moonlight. Claire noticed something then. Ethan never seemed impressed by the luxury around him. He did not stare at the expensive furniture, the family portraits, or the silver decorations that represented generations of wealth. Instead, his attention remained on the windows, the doors, and the people moving quietly through the house. It was as though he had been trained to notice things most people ignored. "Where did you learn to do that?" she asked. "Do what?" "Watch everything." Ethan smiled faintly. "You learn when you spend enough time being overlooked." Before Claire could respond, footsteps approached from the hallway. Harold Mason, the elderly council member who had stared at Ethan earlier, appeared at the doorway. He looked directly at Ethan, then at Claire. "I need to speak with you," Harold said. Ethan's expression became serious. "About what?" Harold hesitated. "Your family." Ethan did not move. Claire felt the atmosphere change. Harold slowly removed a folded document from inside his coat. "I found this in the old council archives." Ethan glanced at it but did not take it. "You should put it back." Harold shook his head. "I cannot." His voice dropped. "Because I finally understand why your face seemed familiar." Claire looked between them. "What does that mean?" Harold opened the document. It contained an old photograph of a young boy standing beside a woman wearing a silver royal emblem. The photograph was faded, but the boy's face was unmistakably similar to Ethan's. Claire stared at it. Ethan remained silent. Harold whispered, "This was taken 20 years ago." Claire looked at Ethan again. "Who is that boy?" Ethan's eyes remained fixed on the photograph. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he quietly answered, "Someone who was supposed to remain forgotten." Harold's hand tightened around the document. Claire felt a chill pass through the room. The man standing beside her was no longer simply the stranger who had offered her a choice. Somewhere inside that old photograph was the beginning of a secret that could change everything she thought she knew about him. The photograph remained on the table long after Harold stopped speaking. Claire stared at the faded image, then at Ethan, trying to understand the resemblance she could no longer dismiss. The boy in the photograph had the same dark hair, the same steady eyes, and the same unmistakable shape of his face. Even the small silver emblem at his collar matched the symbol Ethan had once tried to hide beneath his sleeve. "You know him," Claire said quietly. Ethan looked at the photograph. "I know who he was." Harold shook his head. "You know who he is." The room became silent. Claire looked between them. "Then tell me." Ethan did not answer immediately. He walked toward the old wooden table and rested one hand beside the photograph. His expression was calm, but something guarded had returned to his eyes. "That photograph was taken before I disappeared." Claire felt her breath catch. "You?" Ethan nodded. Harold lowered himself into a nearby chair. 20 years ago, the council believed the royal heir was gone forever. The official records were sealed, and the story was never discussed outside the old families. Claire looked at Ethan. "You were 18. "Yes." "And you have been living here for the past year?" "Yes." She slowly put the pieces together. Ethan had not simply arrived in the community as an unknown man. He had arrived carrying 20 years of silence. "Why did you disappear?" she asked. Ethan looked toward the dark window. "Because I wanted a life where people would judge me by what I did, not by the family I was born into." Claire understood that more than she wanted to admit. She had spent years wishing people would see her the same way. Harold opened the folder again and removed another document. This one carried an ancient silver seal. "There is something else," he said. Ethan looked at him sharply. "Harold. She deserves to know." Claire stepped closer. "Know what?" Harold placed the document on the table. "Your family was connected to his." Claire stared at him. "My family?" Harold nodded. "Your grandmother was one of the few people who knew the truth after Ethan disappeared." Claire felt the room shift beneath her. Memories returned all at once. Her grandmother had always refused to discuss the old royal families. She had kept certain photographs locked away and once told Claire that some names were safer forgotten. Claire had never understood those words. Now she did. "Why would my grandmother know about him?" Ethan finally answered. "Because she helped protect the secret." Claire looked at him. "You knew." "I knew your family name was connected to mine. I did not know how deeply until tonight." Harold carefully turned the photograph over. Written on the back was a single line in faded ink: "The heir must remain hidden until the kingdom is ready to receive him again." Claire read it twice. "The heir," she whispered. "That is what they called him." Ethan said nothing. Harold looked directly at him. "There is only one reason the old council kept searching for the missing heir for 20 years. Claire's eyes moved to Ethan. "What reason?" Harold took a slow breath. "Because the throne was never given to another true Alpha King." Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. The secret had finally reached the edge of the truth. But before anyone could say more, headlights appeared beyond the estate gates. Several vehicles were approaching through the darkness. Harold looked toward the window. "They found you." Ethan turned toward Claire. His expression was no longer that of an ordinary outcast. It was the expression of a man who had spent 20 years preparing for a day he never wanted to see. And Claire suddenly realized that the people arriving at the estate were not looking for an ordinary man. They were looking for someone the kingdom had never truly stopped waiting for. The headlights stopped beyond the estate gates, and for several seconds, nobody moved. Claire stood beside Ethan near the tall window, watching the unfamiliar vehicles arrive beneath the pale moonlight. Harold closed the old folder and held it against his chest. "They are from the council," he said quietly. Ethan nodded. "I know." Claire looked at him. "You expected them?" "Not tonight." The front doors opened moments later, and an elderly woman entered with several formally dressed representatives behind her. She carried a small wooden box marked with the same silver emblem Claire had seen in the photograph. Her name was Eleanor Grant, keeper of the royal records. She stopped when she saw Ethan. Her expression changed immediately. For a moment, she simply stared at him as though 20 years had vanished in an instant. "Alexander," she whispered. Ethan's face remained calm. "My name is Ethan." Eleanor slowly shook her head. "That is the name you chose after you disappeared." Claire looked at him, stunned. Ethan did not correct her. Eleanor placed the wooden box on the table and opened it carefully. Inside rested an ancient silver insignia, preserved beneath a layer of soft cloth. "We searched for you for 20 years," she said. "Why?" Ethan asked. "Because the Alpha Council never accepted that the royal bloodline had ended." Claire stepped closer. "You knew he was alive?" Eleanor looked at her. "We suspected. We had records, witnesses, and fragments of information, but nothing we could officially confirm." She opened another document and placed it beside the photograph. "Until now." Ethan studied the page. It contained an old royal seal and a detailed record of the missing heir. Claire read the words silently. The date matched the year Ethan had disappeared. The age matched. Even the family name matched. She looked at him. "You are the heir." Ethan remained quiet. Eleanor corrected her gently. He is more than the heir. The room fell silent. The last recognized Alpha King vanished before the council could formally name his successor. For 20 years, the kingdom has existed without its rightful ruler. Claire turned toward Ethan. The truth finally settled into place. The quiet man who had repaired furniture, avoided attention, and lived without a family. Name was not simply connected to the throne. He was the person the throne had been waiting for. Ethan looked at Claire. I never wanted you pulled into this. She answered softly, you did not pull me into anything. I chose to stand beside you. Eleanor watched them carefully. That is exactly what concerns the council. Claire frowned. Why? Because the kingdom will not only ask whether Ethan is the lost Alpha King. They will ask who stands beside him. Ethan stepped forward. Claire does not owe the council an explanation. Eleanor nodded. Perhaps not. But the old laws require the king to have a recognized consort. Claire looked down at the silver emblem. I was rejected by my own family yesterday. Eleanor met her eyes. And yet your family name appears in our oldest royal records. Claire froze. Ethan looked equally surprised. Harold slowly opened the final page of the folder. There, beneath an ancient seal, was the Bennett family name. Claire whispered, my grandmother knew. Eleanor nodded. She knew more than you were ever told. Outside, another vehicle arrived at the gates. Ethan looked toward the sound, then back at Claire. The past was no longer hiding. It had found them, and this time, neither of them could simply walk away. The old folder remained open on the table long after Eleanor finished speaking. Claire could not stop looking at her grandmother's name beneath the royal seal. She had spent her entire life believing her family had been ordinary, perhaps even insignificant. Now a single page had turned those memories upside down. Why did my grandmother never tell me? Claire asked. Eleanor lowered her eyes. Because she believed silence was the safest way to protect the people involved. Ethan stood near the window, listening without interrupting. Claire turned toward him. How much did you know? He was quiet for a moment. I knew your family name was connected to mine. I did not know your grandmother had kept the original records. Claire's expression softened, but confusion remained. Then why did you choose me? Ethan looked at her. I did not come here looking for you. But you knew my name. I learned it 3 months ago. Eleanor looked between them. That is important. Claire frowned. Why? Eleanor opened another section of the folder and removed a faded letter. Because this was written by your grandmother shortly after the heir disappeared. Claire recognized the handwriting immediately. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the paper. The message was brief, but one sentence caught her attention. If he ever returns, he must not reclaim the throne without someone beside him who values the man before the crown. Claire read the sentence again. She looked at Ethan. She was talking about you. Ethan nodded slowly. I believe she was. Claire felt tears gather in her eyes, but she held them back. Her grandmother had known about Ethan long before Claire ever met him. She had known that one day he might return. Yet she had never told Claire why. What does this mean for us? Claire asked. Ethan walked toward her but stopped at a respectful distance. It means the council will expect decisions from both of us. And what do you want? He looked at the silver emblem on the table. I want to know whether the kingdom truly needs me, or whether it only needs the idea of me. Claire understood immediately. Ethan had not spent 20 years hiding because he hated his past. He had hidden because he wanted to know who he was without a crown defining every part of his life. Before Claire could answer, Eleanor spoke again. The kingdom needs more than a name. It needs someone who remembers what ordinary people live through. Ethan turned toward her. Then perhaps I should return. Claire looked at him. You are thinking about going to the capital? Yes. And what happens to me? Ethan's expression softened. That depends on what you want. Claire almost smiled. You keep giving me choices. You deserve them. She reached toward the silver emblem but did not touch it. Then I choose to come with you. Ethan stared at her for several seconds. Claire, you do not know what waits there. Neither do you. A quiet smile appeared on his face. That is true. Harold stepped into the room carrying another document. There is one final matter. Everyone turned toward him. He placed the document beside the others. The council has requested that the lost heir return to the capital within 3 days. Claire looked at Ethan. The life they had expected to begin quietly had suddenly become something neither could ignore. Ethan folded the letter and looked toward the darkened window. Then we leave in the morning. Claire stood beside him. For the first time, the future did not feel like something happening to them. It felt like something they were choosing together. But neither of them knew that the capital was already divided over one question, whether the kingdom was ready to welcome its lost Alpha King, and whether the woman who had chosen him before knowing his true name would be allowed to stand beside him. The journey to the capital began before sunrise. Claire sat quietly beside Ethan in the back seat of the waiting car, watching the countryside disappear behind them as the road stretched toward the distant city. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. The old silver emblem rested inside a small wooden box between them, its presence making the silence feel heavier than any conversation could. Are you nervous? Claire finally asked. Ethan looked toward the window. I have not been there in 20 years. That was not my question. A faint smile appeared on his face. Then yes. Claire smiled back. It was the first time she had seen him admit uncertainty. The man who had remained calm through every revelation was finally allowing himself to be honest. You do not have to pretend with me, she said. Ethan nodded. I know. By late afternoon, the towers of the capital appeared beyond the hills. The city was larger than Claire had imagined, with broad avenues, elegant stone buildings, and enormous silver banners bearing the ancient Alpha crest. Crowds had gathered near the royal estate, waiting for news of the missing heir. Ethan watched them through the window without speaking. Claire noticed that his hands had become still. What are you thinking? She asked. I remember this place differently. Because you were 18. Because I believed I would never see it again. The car entered the palace grounds just before sunset. Several members of the council were waiting on the marble steps. Eleanor stood at the center, with Harold beside her. As Ethan stepped out, the entire courtyard fell silent. Some people recognized him immediately. Others looked uncertain. Then Eleanor approached and lowered her head. Welcome home, Your Highness. Ethan did not move. He looked at the palace doors, then at Claire. She gave him a small nod. He finally stepped forward. Inside, the royal hall looked exactly as it appeared in the old photographs. Tall marble columns, silver banners, and portraits of previous Alpha Kings lined the walls. Ethan stopped beneath one portrait. Claire followed his gaze. It showed a young king standing beside his family. Is that your grandfather? She asked. Ethan nodded. He taught me that a crown is a responsibility, not a reward. Before Claire could respond, the council chamber doors opened. Marcus Blackwell stood inside with several senior officials. He was an influential Alpha leader, respected by many members of the kingdom and clearly uncomfortable with Ethan's return. We should not rush this, Marcus said. The council must verify the claim before any formal recognition. Ethan remained calm. Then verify it. Marcus glanced toward Claire. And we must also discuss the woman standing beside him. Claire felt the room change. Ethan looked at Marcus. Her place is not your decision. Marcus replied, if you intend to become Alpha King, everything surrounding your position becomes a matter of the kingdom. Claire stepped forward. Then ask me what I intend to do instead of deciding for me. Marcus studied her for a moment. She did not lower her eyes. Ethan looked at her with quiet respect. Eleanor placed the old documents on the council table. The records are already being verified, she said. The evidence is consistent. Marcus remained unconvinced. Evidence can be interpreted. Ethan finally spoke. Then let the truth speak for itself. Harold opened the oldest record. The silver seal caught the light, and several council members immediately recognized it. One by one, they stood. Claire watched as the room slowly changed from uncertainty to recognition. Yet Marcus remained seated. He looked at Ethan and said quietly, "Even if you are who they claim you are, returning does not mean the kingdom will simply accept you." Ethan answered with complete calm. "I never expected it to." Outside the chamber, the bells of the capital began to ring. Ethan looked toward the sound. 20 years ago, those bells had marked the beginning of his disappearance. Tonight, they announced his return. And somewhere inside the council chamber, a decision was about to be made that would determine not only whether Ethan reclaimed the throne, but whether Claire would be allowed to stand beside him when he did. The council chamber remained silent after Marcus finished speaking. Claire stood beside Ethan, her hands resting calmly at her sides, while the ancient records remained open across the long table. Everyone seemed to understand that the next decision would shape more than Ethan's future. It would determine whether the woman who had chosen him before knowing his true identity would be accepted beside him. Marcus finally looked toward Ethan. "If you return to the throne, you will need a recognized consort." Ethan answered without hesitation. "I already have one." A quiet murmur moved through the chamber. Claire looked at him, surprised by the certainty in his voice. Marcus shook his head. "The council cannot simply recognize a woman because you have chosen her." Claire stepped forward. "Then do not recognize me because he chose me." The room became still again. "Judge me by what I do." Eleanor looked toward Claire with growing respect. Marcus remained skeptical. "You were rejected by your own family only yesterday." Claire nodded. "That is true. And now you expect the kingdom to accept you?" "No," Claire replied. "I expect the kingdom to decide based on the truth, not on yesterday's opinion." Ethan watched her quietly. She did not need him to answer for her. She was standing on her own. Harold opened another section of the royal archive. "There is something the council has overlooked." He placed a faded document on the table. The Bennett family was recognized by the royal household more than 20 years ago. Marcus looked at the document. "That does not make her a suitable consort." Eleanor answered before Claire could speak. "It does establish that her family has an established connection to the royal bloodline." Claire stared at the document. Her grandmother's name appeared again beneath the old royal seal. She finally understood why her grandmother had always treated certain family stories as secrets rather than memories. Ethan looked at Claire. "You do not have to accept any of this." She turned toward him. "Neither do you." He smiled faintly. "You keep doing that." "Doing what?" "Reminding me that I have a choice." Claire looked directly into his eyes. "Because you do." Ethan glanced toward the empty throne at the far end of the chamber. For 20 years, he had believed returning to that room meant surrendering the ordinary life he had built. But now he realized that the choice was not between being Ethan and being the Alpha King. He could be both. He could return without becoming the person others expected him to be. He could lead without forgetting what it felt like to be overlooked. And he could stand beside a woman who had known him before she knew his title. Marcus finally rose from his chair. "There will be a formal recognition ceremony tomorrow morning." Ethan looked at him. "And Claire?" Marcus paused. "She may attend." Claire almost smiled. I did not ask for permission to attend. Eleanor lowered her gaze, hiding a smile of her own. The room understood what had just happened. Claire was no longer asking whether she belonged. She was simply deciding where she would stand. Later that evening, Ethan and Claire walked through the quiet palace gardens. The city lights shimmered beyond the stone walls. "Are you afraid?" Claire asked. Ethan answered honestly. "Yes." She looked at him with surprise. "Good." He laughed softly. "Good. It means you understand what matters." They continued walking beneath the evening sky. For the first time, Ethan did not feel like a man returning to a life that had been taken from him. He felt like a man choosing his future. The next morning, the kingdom would finally see the lost Alpha King standing before the throne. But the question that remained was no longer whether Ethan belonged there. It was whether the kingdom was ready to understand that the woman beside him belonged there too. The royal hall filled before sunrise, every seat occupied as the kingdom gathered to witness the return of the lost Alpha King. Claire stood behind the tall doors with Eleanor, listening to the quiet movement of hundreds of people beyond them. She wore an elegant ivory gown, simple enough to remain true to herself, yet refined enough for the ceremony. Her hands were steady, but her heart was not. "You can still walk away," Eleanor said softly. Claire looked toward the closed doors. "So can he." Eleanor smiled. "That is why you belong beside him." The doors opened. Claire stepped into the royal hall beside Ethan. The room became completely silent. Ethan wore a formal black suit with subtle silver details, his expression calm as he walked toward the empty throne. For the first time, there was no hiding place left. No simple name. No quiet workshop. No life at the edge of the community. The entire kingdom could see him now. At the front of the hall, Marcus stood with the senior council members. He looked toward Ethan, then toward Claire. "Before the recognition begins," Marcus announced, "the council must address one final concern." Ethan stopped. "Speak." Marcus turned toward Claire. "The kingdom needs certainty about the woman who will stand beside its king." Claire remained composed. She had expected this. The old version of herself might have lowered her eyes. This time, she did not. Marcus continued, "Her family was once connected to the royal household, but those records were hidden for decades. Some members of the council believe that is not enough." Claire took one step forward. "Then let me make this simple." Every eye turned toward her. "I did not come here because I wanted a crown. I came because I chose Ethan when I believed he had nothing to offer me except his word." The hall became quieter. If you believe a title is what makes a person worthy, then you have learned nothing from his return. Ethan looked at her, and something softened in his expression. Eleanor opened the oldest royal record and held it high enough for the council to see. The Bennett family was formally recognized by the royal household before the disappearance of the heir. Their service and loyalty were recorded under royal seal. Marcus stared at the document. One by one, the council members examined the evidence. The uncertainty began to disappear. Harold stepped forward. "The records are clear. Claire Bennett has a recognized connection to the royal bloodline." Marcus looked at Ethan. "And if you become king, you intend to keep her beside you?" Ethan answered without hesitation. "She is already beside me." A quiet murmur passed through the hall. Eleanor turned toward the gathered kingdom. "Then let the record show that the lost Alpha King has returned, and that the woman he chose before knowing her family history stands with him by her own choice." The ceremony continued. The ancient silver emblem was presented to Ethan, and the empty throne was no longer empty. But when Ethan finally stood before it, he did not immediately sit down. He turned toward Claire and offered his hand. She took it. Together, they faced the kingdom. Ethan had spent 20 years believing that returning meant becoming someone else. Now he understood that the crown did not erase the man he had become. It only gave him the responsibility to use everything he had learned. And beside him stood the woman who had chosen him before she knew his true name. Outside, the bells began to ring across the capital. This time, they did not announce the return of a forgotten heir. They announced the beginning of a new reign. 1 year later, the same grand hall that had once witnessed Claire's rejection was filled with warm morning light. The crystal chandeliers still hung above the marble floor, the tall windows still overlooked the gardens, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Claire stood beside Ethan at the entrance, wearing an elegant ivory gown, her long chestnut brown hair falling naturally over her shoulders. Ethan wore a refined black royal suit with a silver emblem at his chest. He looked toward the room where their story had begun, then quietly smiled. "Do you remember this place?" he asked. Claire nodded. "I remember everyone looking away." Ethan looked at her. "I remember you refusing to look down." She smiled softly. "You were the one who gave me a reason not to." Together, they walked toward the center of the hall. The people who had once whispered about Claire now greeted her with respect. The same community that had called Ethan an outcast now welcomed him as their alpha king. Yet neither of them seemed interested in proving anyone wrong. Their lives had changed because they had chosen each other before they knew what either of them would become. Later that afternoon, Ethan and Claire stood on the palace balcony overlooking the capital. The city stretched beneath them, filled with ordinary people going about their lives. Ethan rested his hands against the stone railing. "I used to think returning here would mean losing the life I built," he said. Claire looked at him. "Did you?" He shook his head. "No. I brought it with me." Claire smiled. She understood what he meant. The quiet years, the simple work, the lessons he had learned while living without a title, and the people who had once overlooked him had all shaped the king he had become. He had not returned to the throne as the frightened 18-year-old who had disappeared from history. He had returned as a man who understood the value of ordinary life. Claire looked toward the palace gardens. "My grandmother would have been happy to see this." Ethan nodded. "She protected a secret for 20 years. And you kept another one." "I did." Claire turned toward him. "Would you do it differently?" Ethan thought for a moment. "I would still choose you." Her expression softened. "Even if you knew everything from the beginning?" He smiled. "Especially then." The evening bells began to ring across the capital. Their sound carried through the open balcony doors and into the palace halls. Ethan looked toward the silver emblem above the main entrance. It no longer represented a missing king or an unfinished history. It represented responsibility, renewal, and a future built by choice. Claire took his hand, and they stood together in silence as the final light of sunset settled across the city. Years later, people would tell the story of the lost Alpha King who returned after 20 years. They would remember the ancient records, the hidden family connection, the royal ceremony, and the moment the kingdom finally recognized its rightful ruler. But Ethan remembered something much simpler. He remembered a crowded ballroom, a woman standing alone, and the moment he offered her his hand before anyone knew who he was. Claire remembered it too. She had been called the bride no one wanted, while he had been treated as the outcast no one noticed. Yet they had chosen each other before titles, bloodlines, and royal history could influence their decision. And that was why the crown never became the reason they belonged together. It was only the world's final proof of what they had already known: dignity does not come from a title, and worth does not begin when others finally recognize it. Sometimes, the people everyone overlooks are the ones who change everything.